The day the Empire's most feared man walked into her family's ruin, Seraphine Vale was on her knees scrubbing ash from the parlor floor, and Duke Lucien Draven watched her from the doorway like a man who had already decided her entire future before she'd even looked up. Nobody warned her. Nobody ever warned you about the moment your life stopped being yours. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. The cold just arrived ahead of him. That particular silence that falls when something ancient and dangerous enters a room and every living thing in it understands, instinctively, completely, that the calculus of survival has just changed. She felt it in her knees before she saw his shadow, and when she finally raised her eyes, Duke Lucien Draven was already watching her the way a man watches something he has decided to keep. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was how Seraphine Vale would always remember the specific texture of catastrophe. Not in the dramatic, cinematic way the poets described ruin, all storm and lightning and operatic grief, but in the mundane, almost insulting ordinariness of a sealed envelope delivered by a courier who smelled like horse and didn't wait for a tip. She was 18 years old and sitting at the writing desk in the east parlor when the footman brought it in, and the first thing she noticed was the imperial wax seal pressed into deep crimson. Not their family crest, not a banker's stamp, not even the cold, bureaucratic blue of the creditor houses that had been circling House Vale for the better part of 6 months. Imperial crimson, the color of the throne's direct authority. Her hands didn't shake when she broke it. She had trained them not to by then. The language inside was precise, the kind of precision that costs money and exists specifically to make ruin sound administrative. House Vale's outstanding consolidated debt obligations, currently held by 17 separate lending institutions across the capital, had been acquired in full by a single party the previous evening. The consolidation was complete and legally binding. Repayment was now subject to the terms of the new creditor, who had requested a meeting at the Vale estate at noon the following day. No name. Just a seal at the bottom she didn't recognize. A black tower on a field of iron gray. She sat with the letter for a long time. 17 creditors didn't sell simultaneously by accident. That wasn't the market moving. That was someone with enough capital and enough authority to compel 17 separate institutions to liquidate their positions in a single night. That was someone who had wanted every debt attached to House Vale's name consolidated into one fist, cleanly, completely, with no loose threads. Someone had decided to own them. The east parlor looked the way it always had. The same pale green wallpaper her mother had chosen before Seraphine was born. The same writing desk with the ink stain in the lower right corner where her brother Theo had knocked over a bottle at age 7. The same painting of the Vale Country estate above the mantelpiece, all rolling hills and gentle light, the kind of painting that told you what people wanted to believe about themselves. None of it had changed, but the quality of air in the room had shifted in some fundamental architectural way, as though the walls had moved slightly closer without moving at all. She heard her father's voice in the corridor. He was laughing, which meant he didn't know yet. She folded the letter back into thirds and placed it precisely at the center of the desk. And she sat very still, and she thought about everything she knew about debt consolidation, about the dynamics of political acquisition, about what it meant when someone bought your obligation not because they needed the money back, but because they needed something else. She was 18 years old, and she had spent 3 years watching her family drown, and she had learned things in those 3 years that girls her age were not supposed to know. She had learned them anyway. You either learned or you drowned alongside everyone else, and Seraphine Vale had decided very early that she was not interested in drowning. Her father came through the door at 2:15 that afternoon wearing an expression she hadn't seen on him in years. Loose, almost giddy, the expression of a man who had received unexpectedly good news. He was carrying a glass of brandy at 2 in the afternoon, which told her more than his face did. "We may have found a way through," he said. "Possibly." "Who bought our debt?" she asked. The looseness in his face tightened slightly. Not guilt. Her father rarely registered guilt in any visible way, but something like calculation, a brief renegotiation of what he intended to say. "How did you—" She placed the letter on the desk facing him. He read it. His jaw moved once, the way it did when he was revising a position he'd already committed to in his head. "It's an opportunity," he said, "not a threat." Whose seal is that? I have a meeting tomorrow. Whose seal, father? He set the brandy glass down. Lucien Draven's. The room didn't change. The pale green wallpaper stayed exactly where it was. The painting of the country estate remained serene above the mantelpiece. Seraphine's hands remained still on the surface of the desk, which she was grateful for because the inside of her chest had just performed a complicated piece of architecture it hadn't warned her about. Duke Lucien Draven. She had never met him. Nobody in her social circle had met him. He operated in a political register so far above theirs that his name functioned less like a person and more like a weather system, something powerful and distant and periodically destructive that you tracked from a careful remove. He controlled the northern territories, Nocterran and its surrounding kingdoms. Through a combination of military force, strategic marriage alliances he had never once used on himself, and a political intelligence network that the Emperor's own spy masters reportedly considered a serious professional concern. He was 41 years old. He had been married once, very briefly, to a woman who died under circumstances that the capital's drawing rooms had never stopped debating. He had no children. He had no known weaknesses. He had no close friends, no documented romantic attachments, no public vices that anyone had successfully leveraged against him in the better part of 2 decades. He was the Empire's most dangerous man, and he had just bought every debt attached to her family's name in a single night. "He doesn't want money," Seraphine said. "You don't know that. If he wanted money, he would have had his people contact us through the standard channels. He wouldn't have done it this way. He bought all 17 simultaneously, specifically, so we couldn't negotiate separately with any of them." She looked at her father. "What does he want?" Her father picked up his brandy glass again. "I suppose we'll find out tomorrow." She watched him leave the room. She stayed at the desk until the light through the east windows turned amber, and the shadows of the writing implements stretched long across the green surface, and she thought about Lucien Draven. She thought about the single documented thing everyone in the Empire agreed on about the man, the one consistent thread through 20 years of rumor and political report, that he never moved without purpose, that every action he took was the surface expression of a calculation that extended further than anyone watching him could see, that by the time you understood what he was doing, you were already inside the outcome he had designed. Someone had decided to own them. She needed to understand why. She didn't sleep, not because she was afraid, or not only because she was afraid, which was a distinction she had learned to maintain carefully, but because she needed the hours. She went to the estate's account ledgers, which she had been maintaining herself for the past year, because the estate manager her father had inherited along with everything else was 73 and largely ornamental. She went through every line: 17 creditors, the specific amounts, the interest structures, the dates of origination. The debts had accumulated over 8 years, each one a response to a specific financial crisis that her father had addressed by borrowing rather than contracting, by acquiring rather than selling, by the specific aristocratic pathology of believing that the next year would be better and that it was better to owe money than to admit you no longer had it. The total was not survivable. She had known that for 2 years. The number had a quality to it that sat outside the realm of problem solving, the way a structural crack in a foundation eventually stops being a repair issue and becomes an architectural fact. But what she was looking for now was pattern. Not in the debts themselves, but in the timing of them, when each crisis had originated, what had triggered each cascade. She worked through the night. By 4 a.m, she had found 3 things that didn't fit. The first was a series of contracts her father had signed 7 years ago with a commodities house operating out of the eastern provinces, contracts that had appeared at the time to be favorable to House Vale, and which had performed normally for 2 years before the underlying asset collapsed in a way that the contract terms made specifically catastrophic for the Vale side. The asset collapse itself had been attributed to drought and market fluctuation. Standard misfortune. Except the counterparty to the contract had exited their position in the underlying asset 6 weeks before the collapse. 6 weeks. Not 6 days. 6 weeks. Enough lead time to suggest knowledge rather than intuition. The second was a debt instrument issued 3 years ago by a lending house that Seraphine had never been able to trace to any parent institution. She had looked before. The house existed on paper with perfect bureaucratic completeness, but its ownership structure dissolved into holding companies that dissolved into other holding companies that eventually dissolved into a legal address in the eastern provinces that was registered to a man who had died 4 years before the lending house was incorporated. She had flagged it to the estate manager, and he had shrugged and said the legal instrument was valid and the money was real. The third was her father's mood this afternoon, the looseness of it, the brandy at 2 in the afternoon, the word opportunity, the specific quality of relief on the face of a man who had just been told that his problem had a solution, not the relief of someone who had learned the solution, but the relief of someone who had been waiting for someone else to offer one. She sat with those 3 things until the sky outside the east windows turned from black to that specific dark blue that precedes color, and she thought about what they added up to, and then she made herself stop thinking about it because the conclusion they pointed toward was one she wasn't ready to look at directly. Not yet. Not before she had more. She changed her dress. She came down for breakfast at 7. Her father was not yet awake. Yes, he arrived at noon exactly. She heard the horses first, more than she expected, a sound that indicated an escort rather than just transport, the particular quality of organized cavalry that carries a different weight than ordinary travel. She was standing at the window of the second-floor landing when the gates opened, and she watched the procession come through. 6 outriders first, in black with no insignia she recognized. Then the carriage itself, black lacquer, no crests, the kind of intentional anonymity that functions as its own declaration because only men who don't need symbols can afford to travel without them. Then 8 more outriders behind. The carriage stopped. The footman opened the door. The first thing she registered was the size of him. She had expected it. The accounts all mentioned it. But knowing a fact and experiencing it were different operations. He was tall in the way that some men are tall, not just a matter of height, but of presence, the kind of physical fact about a person that reorganizes the space they occupy. He wore traveling clothes, dark, no decoration. He moved without looking at any of his own people, not from arrogance, but from something more efficient than arrogance. The movement of a man who had long ago stopped needing to monitor the machinery around him because it ran without his attention. He looked up. She had moved back from the window before she consciously decided to. She stood against the wall of the landing with her pulse in her throat, which annoyed her. She took a breath. She walked down the stairs. They met in the drawing room, which her father had staged with the careful, transparent optimism of a man trying to create an impression he had no foundation for. The good chairs arranged, the tea service out, the best remaining paintings on prominent display as though Lucien Draven would be influenced by Victorian watercolors. Draven stood at the window with his back to the room when she entered. Her father was already there, already standing in that particular posture he adopted when he was uncomfortable. Weight shifted slightly forward, the posture of someone prepared to be accommodating. "My daughter," her father said. "Seraphine." Draven turned. She had steeled herself for the face, which the capital also had opinions about. It was the kind of face that looked like it had been designed by someone with more interest in function than aesthetics. Not ugly, but cut by experience in a way that made the word handsome feel like the wrong category entirely. A scar that ran from the left cheekbone toward the jaw, thin and old. Dark eyes that did the things she had heard described but not credited. That specific quality of attention that felt like being placed under examination by something with patience and no particular emotional investment in your comfort. He looked at her for 3 seconds. "Miss Vale," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected and carried no performance in it whatsoever. "Duke Draven," she said, and she was proud that her own voice was level. "Leave us," he said. Her father blinked. "I came to speak with your daughter." He did not look at her father when he said it. He was still looking at her. Alone. The quality of silence in the room acquired texture. Her father looked at her with an expression that she parsed in the half-second available to her and found deeply, troublingly complex. Not protective alarm, which she might have expected, but something closer to calculation, to the careful assessment of acceptable cost. "Father," she said, keeping her voice neutral, "it's fine." He left. She watched the door close and then turned back to Lucien Draven and thought, very clearly, whatever happens in this room in the next 10 minutes is the most important thing that has happened to me in my life, and I don't yet know what any of it means, and I need to be very, very careful. Sit, he said. I'm comfortable standing. Something crossed his face that was not quite amusement and was not quite approval, but was something in the vicinity of both. He didn't repeat the instruction. He moved to the window and stood with his hands clasped at his back, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since she walked in, directly, without the social lubrication of pretending not to look. You know who I am, he said. Yes. What do you know? That you control the Northern Territories, that you've held them for 19 years without significant challenge, which is notable because the previous 4 holders didn't manage 5 between them collectively. That you don't have children or documented political heirs, and that this is considered the primary leverage point by anyone who considers you a threat. That you're 41 years old, and that your first wife died 9 years ago, and that the cause has been variously attributed to illness, to accident, and to you, depending on who is speculating and what they stand to gain by it. She paused. That you bought 17 of our creditors simultaneously last night, which is either the most dramatic debt collection mechanism in recent capital history or means you don't want money. He was quiet for a moment. Which do you think? He said. You don't want money? No. What do you want? He looked at her for a long time. Outside the window, somewhere in the estate grounds, a bird was doing something complicated and persistent. The tea service sat untouched between them, the steam from the pot rising in a thin thread and dissipating. I want to marry you, he said. The bird outside kept going. The steam kept rising. I'm 18 years old, she said. I'm aware. You're 41. Also aware. I am the daughter of a bankrupt noble house with no political influence, no significant social connections, and no assets. I represent nothing you could possibly need through marriage. You represent exactly one thing I need, he said, and it isn't any of those. She stood very still. What thing? He crossed the room. He didn't move quickly. Everything he did seemed to operate at the speed of absolute certainty. But he crossed the room and stopped close enough that she could see the detail of the scar and the specific quality of those dark eyes at close range, which was different from across the room in ways she couldn't immediately categorize. You're going to die, he said, if I don't take you out of here. The bird outside went quiet. That's dramatic, she said. It's not drama. It's a timeline. Whose timeline? The Emperor's. She felt the drawing room recede slightly around the edges, the way a space does when the thing being set in it is too large for its dimensions. She maintained her expression. She held his gaze. Why would the Emperor want me dead? Because of what you are, Lucien said, which is something your father has never told you and which the Emperor has spent the last several years trying to ensure you never learn. Her pulse was doing something specific in her throat that she was choosing to ignore. Tell me. Not here. Not before you've agreed to come with me. You want me to agree to marry a man I've never met, leave everything I know, travel north into territories I have no knowledge of, based on a threat you won't explain and a reason you won't give me. Yes. That's insane. Yes. Something in his face shifted. Not softening, exactly, but recalibrating to a register she hadn't seen yet. I know what I'm asking. I know what it looks like. I know that nothing I'm telling you gives you any rational reason to trust me. He paused. I'm asking anyway. Why? He looked at her for a long time. Because I failed once before when I should have moved earlier. Because the woman I failed was important to me and she died because I waited too long. His voice was level, uninflected, carrying its weight without theatrics. I won't make that mistake again. The room was very quiet. Who was she? Seraphine asked. He held her gaze. Your mother, Shaitan. The world didn't end. The drawing room walls stayed where they were. The tea continued its slow, indifferent cooling. Seraphine Vale stood in the center of the room her father had staged for an impression, and felt something happen inside her chest that didn't have a clean name. Not grief, because she had grieved her mother years ago, and that process had its own architecture by now, but something adjacent to it, something about the specific geometry of an old wound being re-entered from an unexpected angle. Her mother had died when Seraphine was 12. Illness, they had said. A fever that moved too fast. She had been buried in the Vale family plot on the country estate, in the ground below the rolling hills of the painting above the mantelpiece, and Seraphine had stood at the graveside in the rain and felt the specific bewilderment of watching the primary organizing fact of your world be placed underground and covered over. "You knew my mother," she said. "Yes." "How well?" Something moved across his face. Complex, internal, briefly visible, and then not. "Well enough that her death was not something I recovered from easily." She studied him. She was doing the calculation, the timeline, the ages, the geography, the shape of what he wasn't quite saying, and what the space around it suggested. She was 18. Her mother had died when she was 12, 6 years ago. Lucien Draven was 41, which meant 6 years ago he would have been 35, which meant she ran the calculation further back, tried to establish when a connection between them might have begun, what the social geography of it would have looked like, what was possible, and what the specific weight of his voice suggested about how possible it had actually been. "You loved her," she said. He didn't answer immediately. "That word covers a lot of territory," he said finally. "Yes." "And she died." "She was executed," he said, "privately. It was staged as illness. The Emperor's people have been doing that for 30 years. It's a very clean mechanism. You die of something common, the documentation is correct, the physicians are cooperative because they have no other option, and the only people who know the truth are the people who ordered it and the people who couldn't stop it." His voice was flat. Delivering this the way you deliver information you've carried for so long, it stopped being acute. "I was 3 days away when it happened. I should have moved her earlier. I had intelligence that suggested the risk was escalating, and I calculated that I had more time than I had." A pause. "I was wrong." "Why was she a target?" He looked at her steadily. "For the same reason you are." She let the silence hold for a moment, listening to the shape of it. "My bloodline," she said. "Yes." "Tell me." "Your maternal grandmother," he said, "was the eldest daughter of Emperor Valeron II. She was removed from the succession through what the official records describe as a voluntary renunciation, which was not voluntary and which was arranged to secure a political alliance that required her to disappear from the line of succession quietly, rather than noisily. She married a Vale ancestor, moved north, and her descendants have been Vale nobility for 4 generations. He paused. The renunciation was never properly executed under imperial constitutional law. It lacks the witness countersignature that makes it legally binding, which means the bloodline claim it was meant to extinguish has never actually been extinguished. She stood very still. "You're telling me I have a legitimate claim to the imperial throne," she said. "One of several," he said, "but the cleanest one technically, because the renunciation flaw affects your lineage and not the others, which is why Emperor Cassian has been working to eliminate your line for the better part of a decade. He killed my mother." "Yes." "And my family's debt crisis was not accidental," he said. "No." She thought about the ledgers, the contracts that had failed in patterns, the lending house incorporated in the name of a dead man, the way each financial crisis had arrived on a timeline that, when you looked at it with the right frame, had the quality of orchestration rather than misfortune. Her father's face this afternoon, the loose, relieved expression of a man who had been told his problem, had a solution. The brandy at 2 in the afternoon. She thought about the specific thing she hadn't let herself look at directly last night, the conclusion the 3 anomalies in the ledgers had pointed toward, that she had made herself stop approaching because she wasn't ready. "My father knew," she said. Lucien Draven said nothing. "He was part of it," she said. "That's what you're not telling me. He helped orchestrate the conditions, not the debt itself. That's it. The debt was real, the losses were real, but he knew why it was happening and he cooperated with it. He thought if he assisted in eliminating my mother, in creating conditions that would neutralize my claim by destroying House Vale's standing, the Emperor would protect him. She heard her own voice from a strange distance, level and precise, performing an analysis that the rest of her was not yet prepared to absorb. And when the Emperor continued to close in regardless, he arranged, or was arranged for, this meeting, because someone offered him something in exchange for delivering me cooperatively. Lucien's jaw moved once. "Is that accurate?" she said. "Substantially," he said, which was the worst possible answer because it left room for things to be even worse than she'd described. The drawing room, the stage chairs, the best remaining paintings on display. Her father's expression when Draven told him to leave. Not protective alarm. Calculation. The assessment of acceptable cost. She thought about being 12 years old and standing in rain at a graveside. She thought about scrubbing ash from the parlor floor this morning, not because the servants couldn't do it, but because she had needed something physical and concrete to do with her hands while she waited for whatever came through the door at noon. She thought about the letter on the desk with its black tower seal and how she had known, reading it, that someone had decided to own them, and how that word had sat in her mind all night as a threat, a violation, a removal of agency. She looked at Lucien Draven. "If I agree," she said, "I need to understand what I'm agreeing to. Exactly. Not the shape of it, the specific terms. Marriage. Legal, formal, registered in the imperial records. You become Duchess of Noctaren. You come north with me. You're under my protection as long as the threat exists. And in exchange?" Something crossed his face. "Nothing you'll owe me. That's not a contract. That's charity, and I don't want charity. It's a debt," he said, and something in his voice shifted, became quieter and more specific. "That I owe your mother, not you." She stood with that for a moment. "I won't be owned," she said. "I need that to be clear. Whatever the arrangement looks like externally, whatever the court understands it to be, I need you to understand that I will not be managed or controlled or kept. If I come with you, it's because I'm choosing to, and I will continue to choose it or not choose it based on my own assessment." He looked at her steadily. "I bought 17 debt contracts last night," he said, "to prevent someone else from using them to destroy you. I didn't buy you. Make sure you remember that," she said. "I haven't forgotten it yet," he said. She looked at him, at the scar and the dark eyes, and the absolute absence of performance in his face, at the quality of a man who had been carrying something specific for 6 years and had let a fraction of it become visible in the past 10 minutes without seeming to regret it. And she made her calculation. She had 3 options. She could refuse, in which case Lucien Draven would leave and she would remain in a house that was not hers, with a father who had contributed to her mother's death, waiting for an emperor who had already decided she needed to be eliminated. She could agree to the marriage with no trust and no leverage and no understanding beyond what she'd been told in the last 10 minutes. Or she could agree knowing exactly what she was doing, which was placing a bet on the specific quality of a man she had just met, based on insufficient information and a complicated instinct she couldn't fully articulate. Survival had never been a clean calculation. She had known that for 3 years. You made the best read you could with the information available, and you moved, because waiting for certainty was a luxury that circumstances did not offer. "One more question," she said. "Ask it. The whole truth about what I am and where I come from. Not tonight, not a strategic withholding. I want all of it." "You'll have it," he said, "when we're north." She took a breath. "Then yes," she said. "I'll marry you." He looked at her for a moment. 3 seconds, the same length he had looked at her when she first walked in, that same assessment that felt like documentation. Then he said, "We leave at dawn." She nodded once. She walked toward the door. "Seraphine," he said. She stopped. "Whatever your father told you this morning to prepare you for this meeting," he said, "whatever he indicated about his role, about the arrangement, know that what he received in exchange for cooperating with this meeting was not what he was promised." She turned. "What was he promised?" "Protection," he said, "and imperial favor." "And what did he actually receive?" Lucien's face carried something she couldn't read in the half-light of the drawing room. "I'll tell you in the morning," he said, "when there's enough time to explain the rest of it properly." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went upstairs to pack, and she did not go to her father's study to say good night. And when she lay down on the bed in her room for the few hours remaining before dawn, she did not sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about a woman she had buried at 12 years old, and a man who had failed to reach her in time, and a throne she had never known she was descended from, and the very specific texture of being 18 years old in a burning world with no ground beneath you and only forward to go. At 5 in the morning, she heard the horses in the courtyard below. She rose. She took the bag she had packed. She did not look back at the pale green walls of the east parlor, or the painting above the mantelpiece, or the writing desk with the ink stain her brother had left when he was 7. She walked down the stairs and through the front door into the cold, pre-dawn dark of the courtyard, and Lucien Draven's man handed her up into the black carriage, and the gate opened before them. She sat in the interior darkness as the carriage began to move, and she thought about what Lucien had said to her in the last seconds of the meeting. "I'll tell you in the morning when there's enough time to explain the rest of it properly." Not, "Your father is fine." Not, "Your father made the best choice he could." The specific, careful absence of those reassurances, the way he had offered a delay in place of an answer. And earlier, what he received in exchange was not what he was promised. She sat with that in the dark, moving carriage as the Vale estate receded behind her and the northern road opened ahead, and she understood, slowly, the way you understand something when the shape of it becomes unavoidable, exactly what Lucien Draven had not yet told her. She leaned forward and rapped twice on the carriage partition. The window slid open. One of his men, faceless in the pre-dawn dark. "Is my father alive?" she said. The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to be an answer. Then the man said, "The Duke will speak with you at the first stop, my lady," and slid the window closed again. Seraphine Vale sat back in the dark and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and looked at the ceiling of the carriage and felt, for the first time since the letter had arrived on Tuesday, something that was not calculation or survival or forward momentum, something raw and animal and completely unmanageable moving through her like a fault line opening. She pressed it down. She pressed it all the way down. She looked out the window at the black pre-dawn landscape moving past. She was going north. The first stop was a way station 2 hours north of the Vale estate, a squat stone building that smelled like old hay and lamp oil, staffed by 2 of Draven's men who had clearly been there waiting and who moved with the particular efficiency of people operating inside a plan they hadn't originated. Seraphine stepped down from the carriage before anyone could assist her. The sky was the specific pale gray that comes just before color commits to the day, everything suspended in that uncertain light, and the cold hit her face like a hand. Lucien was already standing outside. He had ridden rather than traveled in the carriage. She hadn't known that, had assumed during the 2 dark hours of travel that he was somewhere on the other side of the partition, and the discovery that he'd been outside the whole time felt like information about him. She needed to file somewhere. He looked at her when she stepped down. He didn't say anything about what she'd asked through the partition. He gestured toward the way station door. Inside there was a table, 2 chairs, a lamp, and a pot of something hot that one of his men poured without being asked. She sat. He sat across from her. His men went outside and closed the door. "Tell me," she said. He put both hands around the cup in front of him. "Your father made an arrangement with the Emperor's people 8 years ago. When it became clear that your mother's bloodline claim was being investigated by imperial legal scholars the Emperor had commissioned privately, not publicly, your father was approached. He was given a choice between being included in the threat assessment or being useful. He chose useful. He fed information about your mother's movements, her contacts, the people who had begun reaching out to her about the claim." He paused. "I was one of those people." She looked at him. "I was building a case," he said, "legally, a constitutional challenge to the renunciation's validity. It would have taken years, but it was sound. Your mother was cautious. She didn't want to move without something solid. We were corresponding through intermediaries." Something in his jaw tightened. "Your father intercepted 3 of those communications and delivered them to the Emperor's intelligence service." The lamp between them threw the shadows of their cups long across the table. Outside, one of the horses shifted its weight, hooves on stone. "He handed her to them," Seraphine said. "Yes," she breathed. once slowly through her nose. And last night, when your people approached the 17 creditors, your father was informed through a separate channel that a party was moving to consolidate the Vale debts. He was told it was an opportunity. He was led to believe that if he facilitated a cooperative meeting, that if you came to that meeting willing, not alarmed, the Emperor's people would consider his prior service and extend his protection. That was a lie. Yes, they were going to kill him regardless. Once you were gone from the estate, once I had confirmed you were in my custody and moving north, your father's usefulness ended. He knew things, the arrangement, the communications, the specific mechanism of your mother's death. People who know those things and have no more utility are a liability. She sat with that for a moment. She looked at the cup in front of her, which she hadn't touched. She thought about her father's face, all the versions of it. The face from her childhood, before she'd understood what the expressions meant. The face at the graveside, standing in rain, which she had read as grief and which she was now reclassifying in real time. The face yesterday afternoon with the brandy glass. "Is he dead?" she said. Not a question. She had already received the answer to that through the carriage partition. "By now," Lucien said. "Yes." The lamp flame moved slightly in some current she couldn't feel. She watched it. Grief was a specific physical process she had some experience with. It arrived in the body before the mind was ready for it. A pressure in the chest and throat that didn't care about what you had just learned or how it reconfigured everything or how complicated your feelings about the dead person were. It arrived anyway. She let it arrive. She didn't let it show. "You knew this would happen," she said. "When you came to the estate, you knew he would be eliminated once I left." I suspected the timeline. "Yes." "You could have warned him." "I could have," he said. "He would have run. He would have taken you with him to use as leverage. The Emperor's people would have had you both within a week, in worse circumstances, with no legal framework protecting you." He paused. "There was no version of this where your father survived, Seraphine. I didn't build that condition. I worked inside it." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight. He held her gaze without flinching, without apology, without the specific insult of trying to make her feel better about something that wasn't better. He just gave her the thing as it was. "He killed my mother," she said. "Yes." "And you still—" She stopped, reoriented. "You grieve him." "I don't know what I do," she said, which was the truth. "He was my father. He was what you've told me. Both things are true at the same time, and I don't have anywhere to put either of them right now." "You don't have to put them anywhere right now." "How long until we reach Nocturne?" The shift was deliberate, and he recognized it for what it was. 4 days. "And when we arrive?" "We'll be married formally, before the Northern Lords. It needs to be a matter of official record. It's the legal mechanism that transfers imperial targeting away from you as an individual and onto House Draven as an institution. An attack on you becomes an attack on me, which is a significantly more complicated calculation for the Emperor than eliminating an 18-year-old girl from a bankrupt family. She turned this over. The logic was sound. It was also cold in a way that she was deciding, actively, to sit with rather than resist, because cold logic was something she could navigate. "You've thought about this for a long time." "Since your mother died," he said. She looked at him, at the scar, at the dark eyes that were carrying something she was beginning to be able to read, not well, but slightly. A heaviness that had been there so long it had become structural, the way scar tissue becomes structural. "You blame yourself," she said. "Yes." "Does that help?" Something crossed his face. "No," he said. "Then it's a waste," she said. "Self-recrimination as a permanent condition is just guilt trying to look like accountability." She picked up the cup. The liquid was some kind of bitter tea, and it was hot, and she drank it without caring about either quality. "I'm not interested in being a debt you're paying off. I told you that." "You did." "I meant it." "I know," he said. "It's why I told you everything." She set the cup down. "We should move," she said. "If the Emperor's people know the timeline—" "They know you left the estate with me," he said. "They don't know the specific route. We have time." How much? Enough to do this properly. He stood, but not to waste. She rose. She followed him back out into the pale morning where the horses were waiting and the sky had finally committed to gray, and she climbed back into the carriage without assistance and sat in the rocking dark as the north road opened up ahead of them. And she thought about everything that had just been given to her to carry, and she sorted it with the systematic precision of someone who has understood for a long time that feelings and function were two separate operations that had to be managed separately if either was going to work. Her mother, her father, the throne, the emperor, the man riding ahead of her in the cold. She was 18 years old, and she was moving north into someone else's power with the specific awareness that her old life had just been foreclosed in every direction simultaneously. Not just House Vale's bankruptcy, not just the estate she'd left, but the identity she had built inside all of it, the version of herself that had known who she was even when everything around her was collapsing. That version was gone. Whatever came next would have to be built from what remained. She pressed her back against the carriage wall and closed her eyes and felt the road moving under her. North, 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 and she thought, fine, then I build something harder. They stopped twice more before nightfall, each time at way stations that had clearly been seeded along this specific route in advance. The third stop had food, real food, not travel rations, which told her the logistics of this journey had been planned in detail before he'd ever walked into her drawing room. She ate because she needed to, and because it was something she could control. At the second stop, she met Marin. The woman was standing inside the way station when Seraphine entered, 40 or so, dark-haired, wearing riding clothes that had seen considerable use and carrying herself with the relaxed alertness of someone who had never in their life been the least dangerous person in a room. She looked at Seraphine with clear, assessing eyes and said nothing. "This is Marin Voss," Lucien said from behind Seraphine. "She'll be traveling with us to Nocturne." "In what capacity?" Seraphine said. "Mine," Marin said. Her voice was dry, low, with an accent Seraphine placed as Eastern provinces. "I handle things that require discretion." "What kind of things?" "The kind you'll learn to appreciate when they become relevant." She paused. "The Duke says you're perceptive." "The Duke spoke about me?" "He sent a message 2 days ago. It said, she'll push back on everything, make sure she has room to." Marin's expression didn't shift, but something in it acknowledged Seraphine's surprise. "So I am." Seraphine looked at Lucien. He was watching the exchange with no visible expression. "You planned this 2 days ago," she said. "I planned the possibility of this 2 weeks ago," he said. "2 days ago, I confirmed it was necessary." She thought about that. The specific implication of it, that while she had been scrubbing ash from the parlor floor and reading an imperial sealed letter and lying awake all night in the estate that was already not quite hers anymore, this man had already been 3 moves ahead, already had a route, a cover team, a woman described as handling things requiring discretion, already had a plan that she had stepped into. Not because he'd maneuvered her, but because the circumstances he'd identified had arrived exactly when and how he'd calculated they would. The feeling this produced in her was not uncomplicated. There was something close to fury in it. The fury of someone who has survived by maintaining a careful read on her environment, discovering that the environment had already been rewritten before she looked up. And underneath that, something else. Something she examined briefly, didn't like the implications of, and set aside. "Marin," she said, "what do you know about the Northern Court?" Marin looked at Lucien once. He said nothing. "Everything that matters," Marin said, "and I'll tell you all of it before we arrive." She paused. "Starting with who will want you dead and who will want to use you, which is most of the court, and the handful who will be something else." "What's the handful?" "Complicated," she said, "like everything up there." They rode through the first night and into the second day, and the landscape changed around them with the gradual, undeniable quality of a world becoming itself more fully. The gentle agricultural south giving way to harder ground, rockier, the trees thicker and darker, the air carrying something in it that hadn't been there before. A quality of altitude and distance. Marin talked. She talked the way someone talks when they have been briefed extensively and are competent enough to deliver it without notes. The northern lords, their holdings, their specific grudges and alliances, and the particular ways each of them had made their accommodation with Lucien Draven's authority, or had tried not to, and had been corrected. She talked about the fortress city of Nocturne, its geography, its political structures, the way the court functioned. She talked about what a new duchess would represent to people who had spent years reading every movie Lucien Draven made for signs of strategic intent. Seraphine listened and asked questions and stored everything with the specific, hungry efficiency of someone who understood that information was the only currency she was going to arrive with. On the second night, at a proper inn that Lucien's advance men had secured and cleared, she sat across from him at a table while Marin stood watch outside, and she said, "The Northern Lords. How many of them know about the bloodline claim?" "None," he said. "Will they? Eventually, when it's necessary? And until then, they'll believe what everyone else believes, that you bought a bride." "Yes?" She studied him. "Does that bother you?" "No. It bothers me." Something shifted in his face, not apology. She was getting a clearer read on him now, understanding that apology wasn't a mechanism he used, that he expressed things differently or not at all. But acknowledgement, the specific recognition of someone absorbing a cost they've accepted. "I know," he said. "I won't perform it," she said. "Whatever the court expects from a wife who came to her marriage through debt acquisition, I won't perform deference or gratitude or fear. I'm not asking you to." "What are you asking me to perform?" He was quiet for a moment. "Survival," he said. "Just that." She looked at him across the table in the inn's low light and thought about survival, the specific shape of it, how it had looked different at every stage of her life, how it had required different things from her each time, how it had gradually stripped away versions of herself she'd thought were permanent until what remained was something she didn't have a clean name for yet, something harder, something that had been building in the marrow for 3 years and was now being asked to operate in a completely new environment with completely new rules and completely new threats. "Tell me one thing," she said. "Ask it." "What you're building in Nocturne," she said, "the military force, the political intelligence, the 20 years of strategic positioning, what's the actual endgame? Not the tactical reason you married me. The full scope." He looked at her for a long moment. "To be in a position," he said carefully, "when the emperor's corruption finally collapses the empire, which it will, the fiscal and political structures are already past the point of self-correction, to determine what comes after. Not for myself," he paused, "for something better than what exists." "Better defined how?" "Defined by whoever holds the cleanest legitimate claim to rebuild it," he said, "under constitutional principles that don't allow what happened to your mother to happen again." The inn was quiet around them. Somewhere above, a floorboard creaked. Seraphine looked at him and felt something land in her chest. Not softness, nothing as vulnerable as that, but a reorientation. A recalibration of the map she was building of this man, who was dangerous and cold, and had let her father die, and had planned her future before she'd looked up from a parlor floor, and who was also, apparently, carrying 20 years of a dead woman's memory and a constitutional legal theory, and a plan that extended so far past his own lifespan that it only made sense if the point was never him at all. "You're going to get yourself killed," she said. "Probably," he said. "And you plan to bring me into this anyway." "I plan to give you the option to be part of something that could protect you, and possibly matter," he said. "Whether you take that seriously or use it as an escape route is your business." She sat with that. Then she said, "Show me the maps of Nocturne." He studied her for half a second, the assessment, the documentation, and then he called for Marin, and they spread the maps across the table in the firelight, and Seraphine leaned over them and began to learn the shape of the place she was going, and she did not look up for 2 hours. And when she finally did, the fire had burned low and Lucien Draven was watching her with an expression she couldn't read yet, but that she stored carefully for later. They reached the outer boundary of Draven's northern territory on the 4th morning. She knew it before anyone told her, felt it in the quality of the landscape, which had been becoming more itself for days and now arrived at something final and committed. The trees here were enormous, black-trunked, the kind that looked like they had been there since before anyone had thought to name them. The road became a gate. The gate was manned by soldiers who wore the Black Tower insignia and who straightened as the carriage came through with an efficiency that was different from performance, the efficiency of people who operated inside real authority and knew exactly what it meant. Marin knocked on the carriage partition. 2 hours to the city, she said through the window. Seraphine sat up straighter. She smoothed the traveling dress that she had worn for 4 days, and that was, objectively, not the entrance she would have chosen. She thought about what Marin had told her about the court. She thought about the lords who would be watching her arrival and reading everything they could from how she moved and where she looked, and whether she seemed like someone who had been acquired or someone who had arrived. She thought about what Lucien had said at the waystation table. "I didn't buy you." The carriage crested a rise, and through the window the fortress city of Nocturne came into view. Enormous, ancient, dark stone, rising from the valley floor against the gray sky like something that had grown from the rock rather than been built on it. Walls that had withstood things she couldn't yet imagine. Towers that had been watching this landscape for longer than her bloodline had been trying to survive. It was the most brutal and beautiful thing she had ever seen. She felt her spine straighten further. Outside, hoofbeats. Lucien's horse came alongside the carriage window, and she turned her head, and he was there, riding even with her, and he looked at her through the glass with that same assessing gaze, and she held it. Then she looked back at Nocturne. She was still looking at it when the carriage lurched beneath her, and Marin threw the door open from outside and said, in a voice stripped of everything but urgency, "Stop the horses. Now. Imperial riders on the south road. They're already inside the outer gate." Seraphine was out of the carriage before Marin finished the sentence. Lucien was already dismounted. He was looking south, where the road curved behind a stand of black trees, and she could hear it now as horses, fast, too many, the kind of approach that had nothing casual in it. "How many?" he said to Marin. 12 that I can see. Imperial colors. They're carrying a sealed writ." "What kind of writ?" Marin looked at him. Then she looked at Seraphine. Something in her face locked down. "Arrest," she said. "Imperial arrest warrant, in the Duchess's name." A pause. Signed by the Emperor himself. The sound of the approaching horses grew louder. The soldiers at the gate behind them had their hands on their weapons and were looking at Lucien. Seraphine stood in the road between the black trees and the fortress she hadn't yet reached and felt the air around her do what it had done in the drawing room 3 days ago. Contract, clarify, sharpen into that specific quality that exists only when the available options are running out. She turned to Lucien. He was already looking at her, and in his face, for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something that wasn't controlled. Something that was calculating very fast under considerable pressure. A man running numbers on a situation that had arrived ahead of schedule, whose face showed briefly, just briefly, the cost of what it meant to have planned for everything except this exact moment. "Can you fight them?" she said. "Here," he said, "in the open, before I've formally registered the marriage with the Northern Lords. If I fight an imperial arrest warrant on a public road, I've just committed open treason." His voice was low and flat. "The North goes to war before we're ready, before you're protected. Then what do we do?" The Imperial riders came around the curve. 12 horses, 12 men in red and gold. And at the front, a man she didn't recognize, carrying a sealed document with the Emperor's mark, already raising a hand to signal halt. Lucien stepped forward. He put himself between her and the riders with a movement so instinctive and complete, she almost didn't register it as a choice. It was the movement of something older than strategy, something that lived in the body and acted without consulting the mind. She stepped up beside him. Not behind. Beside. The Imperial officer pulled his horse to a stop 10 feet from them. He looked at Lucien. He looked at Seraphine. He unrolled the writ. "By the authority of Emperor Cassian, first of his name," the officer said, "Seraphine Vale, formerly of House Vale, is hereby detained pending investigation into crimes of sedition and a legal claim to the imperial succession." He paused. "Duke Draven, you will surrender the woman." The road was very quiet. Lucien's hand was at his side, not on his sword, but close. His posture had done something she hadn't seen it do before. a quality of stillness that was not peace but its opposite, the stillness of something coiled. "She is not Seraphine Vale," he said, and his voice came out at a register that made the nearest horses step sideways. "She is Seraphine Draven, Duchess of Noctaren, my wife, and you have 30 seconds to get off my road before I give my men permission to demonstrate why that distinction matters." The officer stared at him. Seraphine looked at the writ in the officer's hand. She looked at the 12 riders behind him. She looked at Lucien's profile, at the scar and the jaw and the specific quality of a man who had just made a declaration that had exactly one path forward and no path back. "We're not married yet," she said quietly, just to him. "We are as of this morning," he said, equally quiet. Marin witnessed it. The documents are dated and sealed. A beat. "I had them prepared before we left." She absorbed this. The morning paperwork at the way station. The specific care with which he'd managed the timing. She turned to look at the imperial officer, who was looking at his 12 riders and performing a very rapid calculation of his own. And she understood, standing on that road with the fortress behind her and the Empire's men in front of her and Lucien Draven's declaration hanging in the cold air, that the thing she had thought was a threshold she was approaching was already behind her. She had crossed it the moment she walked down the estate stairs in the dark. There was no going back. There had never been any going back. There was only this road and what she built on it, and whether she built it well enough to survive what was already coming. She lifted her chin. She looked at the imperial officer with the clear, level gaze of a woman who had decided, completely and without reservation, exactly who she was. The imperial officer didn't move for 4 seconds. Seraphine counted them. She had learned to count silences the way other people counted money. Precisely, without sentiment, because the length of a silence told you more about a man's real position than anything he said inside it. 4 seconds meant he was doing math. He was looking at Lucien Draven's 32 armed men at the gate behind them, and looking at his own 12 and running the arithmetic of what happened to imperial officers who started wars on private roads without sufficient force to finish them. He rolled the writ back into its cylinder. "The Duke's claim will be verified through official channels," he said. His voice had a quality to it she recognized, the voice of a man choosing survival over pride, making it sound like procedure. House Draven should expect a formal inquiry within the fortnight. "House Draven," Lucien said, "expects whatever it expects." A pause with weight in it. "Ride back the way you came." The officer rode back the way he came. Seraphine watched until the red and gold disappeared around the curve of black trees, and then she let out a breath she hadn't acknowledged holding. Beside her, Lucien was already turning, already in motion, his hand finally moving away from his sword with the deliberate ease of something being stood down. "The marriage documents," she said, walking to keep pace with him. "Show me." He produced them from inside his coat without breaking stride. She took the papers and read them while walking. The language was precise, imperial standard, her name and his name and the date, and Marin's witness signature and a second signature she didn't recognize. The date was indeed this morning. The seal was Draven's house seal, applied cleanly. "The second witness," she said, "one of my men, legally sufficient. Is it going to hold under an imperial inquiry?" "Long enough," he said. She handed the documents back. Long enough was not the same as permanently, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so because there was no productive conversation to be had about it on a public road with his soldiers watching. They went through the gate. Noctaren was larger inside than its walls suggested, which was the first counterintuitive thing about it. The streets were wide and the buildings were built for permanence, everything in dark stone that had the quality of something that had decided a long time ago not to apologize for what it was. The people on the streets watched the carriage pass with a specific northern directness, not the performative deference of the capital, and not hostility either, just assessment. Reading the situation, making their own calculations. She watched them from the carriage window and felt something she hadn't expected, a kind of recognition. These were people who had survived by being honest about what they were surviving. There was something in the quality of their attention that she understood. The fortress itself was at the city's center, rising from the surrounding streets the way something geological rises, not built so much as revealed. They entered through 3 successive gates, each one heavier than the last, and came into a courtyard where the assembled northern lords were waiting. Meryn had described them on the road. Seraphine ran her memory against the faces now. Lord Aldrich Vane, the eldest, controlling the eastern holdings, tall, white-haired, watching her arrival with the specific stillness of a man who had outlasted 4 political regimes by never committing to any of them until the outcome was clear. Lord Castor Rhine, whose military alliance with Draven predated everyone else's by a decade, younger than she expected, scarred along one side of his neck, expression difficult to read. Lady Soren Fell, who controlled the northern passes and whose cooperation was the logistical spine of Nocturne's supply chains, standing slightly apart from the others, watching Seraphine with frank curiosity rather than assessment, which was either better or worse than assessment, and she hadn't yet determined which. And behind them, slightly to the left, a man she hadn't asked Meryn about, because Meryn hadn't mentioned him, or rather, she had mentioned him in passing, a single sentence she was now retrieving with sudden new attention. Edric Vale, Lucien's steward. 30 years in service to House Draven, the man who managed the administrative machinery of Nocturne's political apparatus, who knew every leverage point and every liability and every internal communication that had passed through this fortress for 3 decades. He was watching her with an expression of perfect, calibrated welcome. She filed it. Cut. The formal presentation took an hour. The Northern Lords were correct and careful, which was not the same as warm. Lord Vane offered the specific minimum of courtesy required and no additional surface area. Lord Rhine shook her hand like she was a military asset being assessed for deployment, which she decided to take as respect. Lady Fell said, "You're younger than I expected," which Seraphine answered with, "That's a condition I'm actively addressing." And something in Fell's face shifted minutely in a direction that felt like the beginning of something useful. Edric Vale stood at Lucien's shoulder through all of it, managing the logistics of the reception with the efficiency of 30 years of practice. He spoke to her twice, once to direct her to her chambers with pleasant precision, and once to inform her that the evening's formal dinner would begin at 7 and that her presence was expected. Both times she watched his eyes while he spoke. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she was looking. Then. Her chambers were in the fortress's east tower, large, dark-stoned, with windows that faced the mountains and a fire that had already been lit. Someone had anticipated her arrival with accuracy, which meant the household's information was current and well-organized. Meryn came in 20 minutes after her. "The lords," Seraphine said before Meryn could speak, "Vane is waiting to see which direction the wind blows. He'll commit to whoever looks like they're going to survive this imperial inquiry." Meryn set a bag down on the table. "Rhine is Draven's, genuinely, not politically. They fought together in the Northern Campaign 12 years ago, and Rhine is the kind of man who decides what he owes someone once and doesn't revisit it." Fell. Ambiguous. She's not hostile, but she has her own interests, and she's been watching Draven's position erode with the Emperor for 2 years and trying to determine whether to hold her alliance or start diversifying. And Edric Vale. Meryn went still. It was a specific kind of stillness, not the natural pause of someone collecting a thought, but the stillness of someone who has been asked something they had been waiting to be asked and is now deciding how to answer it. "He runs this fortress," Meryn said. "That's not what I asked. He's been Draven's steward for 30 years. "Meryn," she kept her voice level. "What aren't you telling me?" Meryn looked at her for a long moment. Something was moving in her face. Not guilt, but a calculation, a decision tree running in real time. "I don't have proof," she said. "Tell me what you have." 3 months ago," Meryn said quietly, "a courier was intercepted on the Western Road. Imperial origin, encrypted packet. My people broke the cipher." She paused. The content referenced a contact inside Nocturne, a long-term asset. The description fit Edric's access profile, so the specific intelligence reference could only have come from someone with access to Draven's internal communications. The fire in the hearth popped. Seraphine looked at Meryn. "You didn't tell Lucien," she said. "I brought it to him. He said the evidence was insufficient, that Edric had been with him for 30 years, and that a cipher description wasn't proof. A pause. He believed in him. Of course he did, she said. That's the point. She stood up. She walked to the window. Outside, the mountains were doing what mountains did in early evening, darkening at their edges first, the color draining from the top down, the specific beauty of something indifferent to what happened at its base. She thought about the shape of what she was hearing, a man 30 years in place, embedded so completely in the machinery of Lucien's power that his access was total and his removal would be operationally catastrophic. A man whose loyalty had been treated as a structural given rather than a contingent fact. A man who, if he was what the intercepted courier suggested, had been in position to deliver everything: routes, timelines, legal strategies, the specific plans Lucien had built around the bloodline claim, the marriage, the constitutional challenge. The imperial officer on the road this morning, 12 riders already inside the outer gate, moving on a timeline that had anticipated their arrival with precision. She thought about how that kind of intelligence traveled. "Does Edric know about my bloodline?" she said. "Yes," Merrin said. "Draven told him 2 weeks ago, when he began planning the extraction." She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone of the window frame. 2 weeks of Edric knowing. 2 weeks of every plan, every route, every legal mechanism, every detail of what Seraphine was and why she mattered, flowing through a man who had been selling Draven's intelligence to the Emperor for how long? 3 months of documented contact, but a cipher describing a long-term asset. Long-term. "How long?" she said. "The cipher language suggested years," Merrin said. "My people thought possibly as long as 5. 5 years. 5 years of the Empire's most dangerous man having his own machinery used against him by the person running it. "I need to tell him," she said. "He won't—" "I know he won't want to hear it." She turned from the window. "That's not the question. The question is what happens if we don't move on this before the Emperor's next play." She looked at Merrin. "What's Edric's access to the marriage documents?" Merrin's jaw tightened. "Complete. And to the plans for filing the constitutional challenge with the imperial courts. He drafted the filing schedule. So he knows every date, every legal mechanism, every point at which we're exposed." "Yes." She was already moving toward the door. Poisson. She found Lucien in the war room, a long chamber on the fortress's second floor, maps on every wall, a table that had accumulated the specific organized chaos of an active strategic operation. He was standing over the central table with 2 of his military commanders, speaking in a low voice about the southern border positions. He looked up when she entered. Something in his expression registered the quality of her arrival, not interrupting but preempting the entrance of someone who was not going to wait. "Give us the room," he said to his commanders. They left. She closed the door. "Edric," she said. His face didn't change immediately. "What about him?" She told him everything Merrin had told her. She told it precisely, without editorializing, giving him the facts in the order she had received them, and the conclusion she had drawn from the morning's events as corroboration. She watched his face while she spoke. She watched it very carefully. What she saw was not what she expected. She had expected resistance. The resistance Merrin had described, the 30-year investment being defended against insufficient evidence. She watched for that. Instead, she saw something that moved too fast and was too specific to be simple denial. Something that had the quality of a man hearing something he had already, in some partially formed, unacknowledged way, known. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "The courier was 3 months ago," he said. "The documented contact. Merrin thinks the relationship is older." Another silence. He was looking at the maps on the table without seeing them. She could tell by the quality of his focus, which had gone inward to somewhere the maps weren't. "He was with me in the northern campaign," he said. "I know. He was with me when my wife died. He managed everything." His voice was flat, carrying it. "He has been—" "I know what he has been," she said. "That's exactly the problem." He looked at her. In his face, something she hadn't seen before, a crack in the architecture. Not grief exactly, not anger exactly, but the specific expression of a man processing the specific betrayal that only people who trusted you deeply enough to be useful can deliver. The kind of wound that doesn't announce itself as a wound because it comes from a direction you hadn't bothered to defend. She understood that expression. She had seen it in her own mirror this morning, in a different register. "We can't confront him yet," she said. "If he knows we know, he disappears or he signals the Emperor. We need to know what he's already sent before we move on him." "What are you suggesting?" "Let him believe everything is normal through tonight's dinner. Give me access to his correspondence records." "Those are encrypted." "Marin can work the cipher. She's already done it once." She paused. "I need 6 hours." He looked at her for a moment, the assessment, the documentation. 6 hours, he said. She worked through the dinner she didn't attend, through the night, through the specific grinding hours of ciphertext and cross-reference dates, and the slow assembly of a picture that became clearer and more damaging with every layer. Marin worked beside her. 2 of Marin's people brought documents from Edric's office in increments small enough to be undetectable. By 3 in the morning, she had it. Not 3 months of contact. 7 years. Edric Voss had been feeding the Emperor's intelligence service for 7 years, since before Lucien had formally begun building the constitutional case, since the early stages of whatever long game he had been running. Every significant strategic decision Lucien had made in 7 years had been previewed by his own steward to the imperial crown. Her mother's death. She sat with that for a long time. The intermediaries Lucien had been using to contact her mother, the ones her father had intercepted. The question she had not yet asked, which was how her father had known about those communications in the first place. Her father had not been politically sophisticated enough to have discovered Lucien's network independently. Someone had told him where to look. Edric had been in place for 7 years. Her mother had died 6 years ago. The geometry of it settled into place like a stone into water, slow and final and irreversible. She looked at Marin. Marin was already looking at her. "He didn't just betray Lucien," Seraphine said. "No," Marin said. She pressed both hands flat on the table. She looked at the document spread before her. 7 years of meticulous, patient, invisible destruction, carried out by a man who had stood at Lucien's shoulder through all of it, who had stood at his shoulder this morning in the courtyard with his expression of perfect calibrated welcome. She thought about grief. She thought about guilt. She thought about Lucien Draven riding through the dark 4 days ago, 3 days too late, and the specific weight he had been carrying since. He had blamed himself. For 6 years he had blamed himself for a failure of timing that had not been a failure of timing at all. He had been betrayed. He had moved too late because someone in his own house had ensured the Emperor knew exactly when to move. She gathered the documents. She rose. "Where are you going?" Marin said. "To wake him up," she said. Mom. She found him in his study. He hadn't slept, which she had expected. He was at his desk with a cup of something cold and untouched, and the specific stillness of a man holding himself very carefully in place. She set the documents in front of him. She watched him read. She watched the specific, terrible process of a man reassembling his past with new information. 7 years of it. Every decision and failure and loss being reclassified in real time. The architecture of what he believed had happened being disassembled and rebuilt in a configuration that was worse and more honest simultaneously. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally looked up, his face was a controlled ruin. Everything in place, nothing exposed, but the quality of the control was different now. The quality of something holding itself together with a specific force that hadn't been required before. "He fed them my network," he said. "The intermediaries." "Yes." "Your mother." The words were flat and careful. "He told them where to intercept the communications." "Yes." The silence in the study was extraordinary. Outside, the fortress moved through its pre-dawn rhythms, guards on their rotations, the distant clank of something in the kitchen, the world conducting its ordinary business while the center of it cracked apart. "I blame myself," Lucien said, "for 6 years." "I know." "I moved people, changed plans, second-guessed every decision I made in those last weeks because I thought I had miscalculated the timeline." He paused. "I hadn't miscalculated anything. He was telling them what I planned before I moved." She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would address what was happening in his face. and she had learned already that he didn't need her to manage it for him, that what he needed was the truth given cleanly and the space to absorb it without performance. He stood up. He picked up the documents and looked at them one more time and set them down. "Where is he?" he said. "His chambers. He returned from dinner at 10. And he doesn't know we have these." "Not yet." He moved toward the door. She stepped into his path. He stopped. He looked at her. "Not like that," she said. "Seraphine, think." She held his gaze. "If you go to his chambers right now with your face doing what it's doing, he will know in 30 seconds that everything is over and you'll have him in custody, but you won't have what he knows about the Emperor's current operation, what they've been told, what's already in motion." She paused. "You need what's in his head before you take him." The fury in him was a specific, contained thing. She could see it in the line of his jaw, in the way his hands were very still at his sides, in the quality of a man exercising a control that was costing him something real. He breathed. Once. "What do you suggest?" he said. "Breakfast," she said. "At the Lord's table. Normal. You sit at the head, Edric at your shoulder, everything exactly as it always is. Let me sit across from him." She watched him. "Let me read what he knows." "You've never interrogated. I've been reading people in impossible situations since I was 15 years old," she said. "I know what a man looks like when he's calculating whether his cover is still intact. I know what he looks like when he's deciding whether to run." He looked at her for a long moment in the pre-dawn dark of his study. "The assessment, the documentation." "And if he runs," he said, "then you'll have your answer and all 4 of your gates are locked." Another silence. Then, with the specific quality of a man making a decision he hasn't made before and won't unmake once it's made, he said, "All right." She turned to go. "Seraphine." She stopped. "He was in this house," Lucien said, "when I married you, when I told you about your mother, when I filed the marriage documents." His voice was precise and terrible. "He knows everything we've planned, every legal step, every timeline." She turned to look at him. "I know," she said. "Which means the Emperor knows." "Yes." "Which means the inquiry they're sending is not an inquiry." He paused. "It's the opening move of something else." She stood in the doorway of his study in the dark and felt the shape of what he was describing settle over her like a change in weather, the specific cold of a situation that had just become something entirely different from what it had appeared to be. The cold of a game board that had just been flipped while you were still reading your own pieces. She was 18 years old and she was standing in the fortress she had arrived at 12 hours ago, and the man she had married to survive had just handed her the information that surviving was going to require something she hadn't yet become. She looked at him. "Then we have until they arrive to become something they didn't plan for," she said. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "we do." Outside the study window, the sky above the mountains was beginning its first pale movement toward dawn. That specific pre-color gray she had learned to associate with the threshold of things, the moment before the world committed to what the day was going to be. She straightened. She was done being the person who had been planned for. Breakfast was a performance, and Seraphine had been performing since she was 15. She came to the Lord's table at 7 in traveling clothes she had changed into deliberately. Not the formal dress the household would have expected of a new duchess on her second morning, but something practical, dark, the kind of clothes that said she had already decided what the day was going to require. She watched the lords register it. Vane's eyes moved over her once and recalibrated. Fell's expression did something brief and interested. Rhine didn't notice because Rhine was watching the door. Edric Vale was already at his position at Lucien's right shoulder when she sat down across from him. She looked at him directly and smiled, which was the most dangerous thing she had done since she walked down the estate stairs 4 days ago. Not a performance smile, something quieter than that. The smile of someone who is genuinely interested in the person they're looking at for reasons the person doesn't know yet. He smiled back. Correct, calibrated, 30 years of practiced warmth. She watched his eyes. The eyes were doing something the smile wasn't. They were moving. Just slightly, just enough. cataloging the table, the lords, the doors, the distance between his current position and the nearest exit. Not the eyes of a man at a routine breakfast, the eyes of a man running a continuous escape calculation that he had been running so long it had become involuntary. She knew that calculation. She had been running her own version of it for 3 years. You learn to recognize it in other people because it had a specific quality, the quality of someone who understood at a cellular level that the ground beneath them was not permanent. The difference was she ran it because she was the prey. He ran it because he knew the predator's schedule. She picked up her cup and said pleasantly across the table, "Edric, how long have you been managing the fortress's correspondence?" Something moved in his face. Fast, controlled, almost invisible. "Most of my tenure," he said. "The Duke delegates it." "All of it?" "The administrative volume requires—" "I'm curious about the encryption protocols," she said, "for outgoing communications. Marin was explaining them to me last night." She paused. "The cipher structure is interesting." 2 seconds of silence. The lords continued their breakfast around them, their conversations providing cover. Lucien, at the head of the table, was speaking to Rhine about garrison positions and did not look at her. Edric's face was perfect, absolutely perfect. The slight frown of someone mildly puzzled by an unexpected topic. No fear, no calculation, nothing. 30 years of practice. But his right hand, resting on the table beside his cup, had gone very still. She let it sit for a moment. Then she picked up her fork and began eating and shifted the conversation to the mountain weather and whether the northern passes would stay open through the season. And she watched him realign, watched the recalibration happen in real time as he concluded, or tried to conclude, that it had been a random question, that she didn't know, that the cipher reference was coincidence. She let him conclude it. She ate her breakfast and she watched the stillness in his hand and she thought, "You have maybe 4 hours before you decide you can't wait any longer, before you decide the risk of staying outweighs the risk of running, and you find a reason to leave the fortress on routine business and you don't come back." She looked down the table at Lucien. He was still speaking to Rhine, but his eyes moved to her for exactly half a second. She gave the smallest possible nod. He understood. The imperial envoy arrived at 10. Not 12 riders this time. 40. And behind the riders, a formation of soldiers moving in the specific organized structure of a military escort rather than a diplomatic procession, the kind of formation that carries something it intends to deliver regardless of reception. Seraphine was in the war room with Marin when the gate alarm sounded. She was at the window before the echo died. "That's not an inquiry," Marin said. "No." She counted the formation. 40 soldiers, a closed imperial carriage, and behind it, she leaned closer. 2 additional carriages, unmarked, that had the quality of transport rather than travel. The kind of carriages that moved things rather than people. "What's in those?" she said. Marin was already gone from the window, already moving. "I'll find out." Seraphine went to find Lucien. He was in the courtyard, already receiving the envoy, already performing the specific version of himself that he deployed for imperial contact. Correct, cold, carrying that quality of absolute stillness that communicated more threat and silence than most men managed with weapons drawn. The imperial envoy was a different man from yesterday's officer. Older, senior, wearing the insignia of the emperor's personal chancellery. He handed Lucien a sealed document without preamble. Lucien read it. She watched his face while he read and saw the moment the content landed. Not a crack, not even a visible shift, just a quality of compression, as though whatever he was holding inside himself had just been asked to hold considerably more. He handed it to her. She read it. The language was imperial legal standard, precise and cold. House Draven was hereby notified that the marriage contract filed under the date in question was under formal challenge on grounds of procedural deficiency. Pending resolution of the challenge, the individual identified as Seraphine Vale was to be remanded to imperial custody as a person of interest in an active investigation of seditious claims against the throne. Duke Draven was reminded that interference with imperial legal process constituted treason under statute. At the bottom, in a separate section with a different seal, the emperor's personal mark, not the chancellery's, a single additional clause. All northern territories under House Draven's administration were hereby placed under imperial oversight pending resolution. Lord Edric Vale, as senior administrative officer of Nocterran, was appointed interim imperial liaison with full authority to manage territorial communications. She read that last section twice. Edric had written this, not literally, but the specific shape of it, the mechanism of it, using his own appointment as the structural key that would open Nocterran from inside while the imperial soldiers held the outer doors. This was not the Emperor's plan. This was Edric's plan, with the Emperor's seal on it, delivered by the Emperor's men, and it was elegant in the specific devastating way that only plans built from complete inside knowledge could be elegant. She folded the document and handed it back to Lucien. She looked at the envoy. "When was this document prepared?" she said. The envoy blinked. People did not generally ask him questions. "The Chancellery?" "The date on the document is 3 days ago," she said. "Before we arrived. Before the marriage filing was submitted." She paused. How did the Chancellery draft a challenge to a filing that hadn't happened yet? The silence that followed had a quality to it. She watched the envoy's face perform the calculation of whether to answer that question and arrive at the conclusion that there was no good answer. "Take your soldiers to the outer yard," Lucien said to the envoy. His voice had dropped to a register that required no volume to carry. "You'll wait there while we review this document with our legal counsel." "Duke Draven, the terms require—" "The outer yard," he said. The envoy went to the outer yard. Yet, they had 40 minutes. She knew it wasn't more than that. 40 minutes before the envoy's patience ran out, or before Edric realized the window was closing and forced the situation himself. Lucien convened Rhine, Fell, and Vane in the war room. He didn't convene Edric. He laid the document on the table and let them read it. He let the silence do its work. Then he said, "The appointment in the final clause was arranged by someone inside this fortress." Vane looked up. "That's a significant claim." "It's a documented fact." He laid Seraphine's cipher evidence beside the imperial document. 7 years of correspondence. The last transmission was 4 days ago, the night before we arrived. Bell read the cipher transcripts with the focused speed of someone who understood what she was reading. Rhine read them once and put them down, and his face did something specific and cold. "Edric," Rhine said. Not a question. "Yes." "Where is he now?" "In the fortress," Lucien said. "He doesn't know we have these." Rhine stood up. "Then we have about 20 minutes before he figures out why he wasn't invited to this meeting." Seraphine looked at Vane. The old lord was still reading, working through the transcripts with the methodical care of a man who needed to be certain before he committed. She watched his face move through the content and arrive at the section that documented the dates relative to Lucien's wife's death, relative to her mother's death, relative to the communications that had been intercepted and handed to the Emperor's people. He set the papers down. "What do you need from us?" he said to Lucien. Lucien looked at him for a moment, the specific look of a man who had not been certain of that answer and was recalibrating accordingly. "Hold the outer gates against the Imperial soldiers. Don't engage. Just hold. I need an hour inside." "An hour for what?" Fell said. "To take Edric into custody and break the document's legal foundation before it can be enacted." He paused. "The appointment clause only activates if Edric is free to assume the liaison role. If he's in custody on documented treason charges, the mechanism fails." "And the Imperial soldiers outside," Vane said, "are here to enforce a document that will be legally voided within the hour," Seraphine said, "if we move fast enough." She looked at Lucien. "You need to go now." He looked at her. "Go," she said. She didn't go with him. That was deliberate. She stayed in the war room with the lords because someone needed to manage the next conversation, and because Lucien going alone to take Edric meant his attention could be entirely on the man he had trusted for 30 years rather than on her, and she had decided sometime in the last hour that she was not going to be a liability. He managed while fighting the actual battle. She was going to be something else. She spread the maps on the table and looked at Rhine. "The outer gate," she said. "Can your men hold 40 Imperial soldiers without engaging?" "Hold, yes. Without engagement." He tilted his head. "If they push, we push back." "They'll push if they receive a signal from inside the fortress that the plan is failing." She traced the internal layout with her finger. The envoy will be watching for Edric to appear at a window or door. Some confirmation that the liaison appointment is proceeding. If Edric doesn't appear in the next 30 minutes, they breach, Bell said. Yes. She looked at the gate positions. I need someone controlling the signal the envoy receives. I need him to believe the appointment is proceeding for as long as possible. She looked at Fell. You're the highest-ranking person in this room who isn't a man the imperial envoy has orders to arrest or detain. Fell looked at her steadily. You want me to go out to the envoy and stall? I want you to go out to the envoy and be a senior northern lord with concerns about the legal process that require careful discussion. You're not obstructing. You're ensuring procedural correctness. She met Fell's eyes. But you are. Something moved in Fell's face. That same thing that had shifted minutely at breakfast when Seraphine had said she was actively addressing her youth. Not quite a smile. Something more durable than a smile. 20 minutes, Fell said. Maybe 25 if he's pedantic about the law. She stood. Don't waste them. She left. Seraphine looked at the maps. She looked at Vane, who was watching her with the specific attention of a man reassessing a situation he thought he had read correctly. You've done this before, he said. No, she said, but I've been preparing for it for 3 years without knowing what it was. She traced the internal corridor where Lucien would be moving right now. How many of your men are inside the fortress walls? 16. Position them at the secondary gate. If this goes wrong in the next 20 minutes and the outer gate falls, the secondary gate is what determines whether we have a fighting chance or a massacre. He looked at her for one more second. Then he went. And she heard it before she saw it. The specific sound of a confrontation conducted at close quarters in a stone corridor. The kind of sound that starts as voices and becomes something else. She was already moving. She found them in the east corridor on the fortress's ground floor. Lucien had Edric against the wall. Not touching him, but the proximity was its own kind of contact. The specific geography of a man who has placed himself close enough that there is no direction to move that isn't through him. Edric's face had stopped performing. That was the first thing she registered. 30 years of calibrated warmth, completely gone. What was underneath was something that looked more honest. A face that had been wearing a mask so long, the face beneath it had gotten its own expression, older and harder, and without any of the warmth's residue. She found the cipher, Edric said. He wasn't looking at Lucien. He was looking at her. I should have moved faster. You should have done a lot of things differently, Lucien said. So should you. His voice was flat. You were going to get her killed, the same way you got her mother killed. You had a woman with a legitimate claim to the throne, and you were building a legal case, Lucien. A legal case. Against an emperor who murders people who threaten him and calls it illness. Something bitter moved through his voice. Someone had to manage the situation realistically. By selling her to the man killing her. By ensuring the emperor had controlled access to the threat rather than eliminating it. His eyes moved to Seraphine again. He was never going to kill the last one. The bloodline claim is more valuable managed than eliminated. I was the one managing it. She looked at him. She thought about what it would feel like to believe that. To believe you were managing a catastrophe rather than feeding it. To build 30 years of justification around a decision made for reasons you'd long since stopped being honest about with yourself. My mother, she said. Something flinched in his face. Briefly. That wasn't supposed to happen, he said. The Emperor's people moved faster than I was told they would. You were told, she said. You knew the timeline. He said nothing. You knew, she said, and you didn't warn her, because warning her would have required explaining how you knew, and explaining how you knew would have ended this. She looked at him steadily. So you let her die, and you told yourself it wasn't supposed to happen, and you kept going. The corridor was very quiet. Lucien's hand moved to Edric's collar. The movement had in it everything that had been building since 3 a.m. 6 years of misplaced guilt, and a grief he had never properly directed, and the specific fury of a man who has just been handed the real object of 30 years of a wound he had been inflicting on himself in ignorance. The documents, Seraphine said. Lucien stopped. She kept her eyes on him. The liaison appointment. We need him to formally revoke his acceptance of it in writing. If he's in the dungeons and the document stands, the legal mechanism still activates. Lucien's jaw was doing something specific and controlled. We have maybe 10 minutes before Fell runs out of procedural road, she said. He held her gaze for a long second. Then he stepped back from Edric and said, in a voice that was very quiet and very final, "Walk." Edric signed the revocation under witness at 8 minutes past the hour. His handwriting was steady, which told her something about the specific quality of a man who had been compartmentalizing for 30 years. The hand didn't shake even when the self had nowhere left to go. Marin took him to the lower cells. Seraphine took the signed revocation and the cipher transcripts to the outer courtyard, where Lady Fell was deep in what appeared to be an extraordinarily detailed conversation with the imperial envoy about the specifics of procedural law governing emergency marshal appointments. She handed the envoy the revocation. She handed him the cipher transcripts. She said, in a voice that carried no performance and no apology, "The appointed liaison has been taken into custody on documented charges of 7 years of treason against House Draven. The appointment is void. The challenge to the marriage contract was filed on intelligence provided by a documented traitor, which constitutes fraud on the court. Your document has no legal foundation." The envoy stared at her. "You're welcome to wait while your chancellery verifies this," she said, "or you can take the documents to the Emperor directly." She paused. "I'd recommend the latter. The Emperor will want to know that his intelligence source inside this fortress has been neutralized. That information has time value." The envoy looked at his 40 soldiers. He looked at Rhine's men on the walls. He looked at the closed fortress gates and the document in his hands and performed the specific calculation that imperial functionaries performed when a situation had moved decisively outside the parameters of their instructions. He rode back to the capital with his 40 soldiers and his voided document. She watched them go from the outer wall. She stood there for a while after the dust settled, in the cold northern air with the mountains at her back and the empty road ahead, and she felt the specific quality of a body coming down from an extended state of extreme function. The shaking hands she hadn't noticed during. The exhaustion that arrived only when the necessity of performance had passed. She breathed. She had held an imperial envoy's 40 soldiers outside a fortress's gates for 37 minutes, while simultaneously managing 3 northern lords and a treason arrest and a legal revocation, using nothing but the information she had assembled in the dark and the specific, unglamorous willingness to think faster than the situation was moving. She was 18 years old. She thought about that. She thought about who she had been 6 days ago, on her knees in the parlor of an estate that was already not quite hers. She thought about the distance between that floor and this wall, and what had been shed in the crossing, and what had hardened in its place. She heard footsteps on the wall behind her. Lucien came to stand beside her. He looked at the empty road. "It's not over," he said. "I know. The Emperor knows the liaison plan failed. He'll know within 3 days. He'll move with something larger." He paused. "We've lost the legal timeline. Constitutional challenge can't be filed quietly now. He'll block every court." "Then we file it loudly," she said. He looked at her. "Openly, in front of the northern lords and every ally you have across the empire." She turned to face him. "You've been building this for 20 years through legal mechanisms and strategic positioning and working inside the system because you believed the system could be used." She held his gaze. "The system is compromised from the inside out. You know that now. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," she said carefully, "that there is a version of this where we stop asking the Empire's institutions to validate a claim and start building the conditions under which those institutions become irrelevant." He was very still. "Your northern lords," she said. "Rhine is yours." Vane moved when he saw the evidence. Fell is watching which way this falls. What would it take to have all 3 of them committed? Genuinely committed. That depends on what you're asking them to commit to. She turned back to the road. The dust from the envoy's departure had settled completely. The northern sky was that specific hard blue that had no warmth in it, the color of a sky that had never pretended to be anything it wasn't. 3 days, she said. "You said we have 3 days before the Emperor moves." "Approximately." "Then we use them." She turned and walked back toward the fortress gate, and she heard him follow, and she didn't look back because there was nothing behind her worth looking at anymore, and everything forward still to be built. And somewhere in the machinery of her chest, she felt something that she didn't have a safe name for yet. Something that was not hope exactly, not certainty exactly, but the specific raw material that those things were made of. The gate opened ahead of her. She walked through. She was 3 steps inside the courtyard when Marin came at a run from the direction of the lower cells, and her face had the specific quality of someone carrying news that has no good version. Seraphine stopped. "What?" she said. "Edric," Marin said, breathing hard. "He's gone." The courtyard went silent around them. "The cell was locked," Marin said. "My people were outside the door. He had a key we didn't know about, a secondary mechanism built into the cell structure. He's been in that cell before. He built an exit into it." She paused. "He's been planning this contingency for a long time." Seraphine felt something go very cold and very clear in the center of her chest. A man who built an exit into his own cell had never believed the plan would hold. He had built the exit before any of this, before the cipher was broken, before the breakfast table, before the revocation. He had built it the way you build an exit when you know at some level that the weight you're carrying cannot be carried forever, that the day will come when the only direction available is out. He was in the fortress. He knew every corridor, every gate, every guard rotation, and he had nowhere to go except to the one person who still had use for what he knew. "He's going to the Emperor," she said. "Yes." "Not through the main road. Fel's people are watching it." She turned to Lucien, who had come to stand behind her with his face doing that controlled ruin thing again. "The northern pass. The one Fel controls." His jaw tightened. "If he reaches the pass before Fel's people get word," she started. "He knows the pass better than Fel's people do," he said. "He managed the supply routes for 15 years. She looked at him. "He'll reach the Emperor," she said, "with everything. Every detail of the constitutional challenge, every name of every ally you have across the Empire, the specific legal strategy, the bloodline evidence." She paused. "Everything we need to execute this is in his head, and he's walking it directly to Cassian." The courtyard was silent around them. The northern sky above was that hard, cold blue, indifferent and enormous. She felt Lucien make the decision before he moved. She felt it the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure before weather arrives. In the specific quality of his stillness, the last half-second of a man choosing something that couldn't be unchosen. "Rhine," he said, and his voice had dropped to something that carried without volume. "Full cavalry, northern pass, now." Rhine was already moving. "Lucien." She put her hand on his arm. She felt the tension in it. Not the tension of someone being stopped, but the tension of something immense moving forward and being briefly touched. "If you ride hard enough to catch him, and the Emperor's advance riders are already in the pass, then I'll have the fight 3 days early," he said. He looked at her. His face was open in a way she hadn't seen it, not cracked, not ruined, but open. The way a room is open when all the furniture has been moved out and you can finally see the shape of the walls. "Stay in the fortress," he said. "Hold the lords. Don't let Vane recalculate while I'm gone." "I know," she said. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned and walked to his horse, and he mounted in a single motion with the specific efficiency of a man who had been getting on war horses for 20 years, and Rhine's cavalry formed up around him in the controlled urgency of people who had done this before, and the northern gate opened. She watched him ride. She stood in the courtyard with Marin at her side, and fell in Vane appearing from the direction of the war room and the hard blue sky above Nocturne going darker at its edges as the afternoon moved, and she watched Lucien Draven ride north toward a pass he might not come back from, and she felt the full weight of everything that had happened in 5 days settle into her bones simultaneously. She was still standing there when Marin said quietly, "Riders on the southern road, imperial colors." She turned. The main road south, the one the envoy had left on 3 hours ago, had new dust on it. A lot of dust. The kind of dust that came from a significant force moving with purpose and speed. She looked at the dust. She looked at the northern gate, now closed, where Lucien and Rhine's cavalry had disappeared. She did the arithmetic of distance and time and forces and probability with the cold, fast precision she had developed over 3 years of managing impossible situations, and what the arithmetic produced was this. The Southern force and the Northern operation were both moving simultaneously, which meant this was not a response to this morning's events. It was too fast for that, which meant it had been planned before the envoy arrived, which meant Edric's escape was not an escape. Edric's escape was the signal. He had not run to warn the Emperor. He had run to tell the Emperor that the fortress's internal controls were occupied with his own capture, that Lucien had been drawn north, that the southern gate was the relevant point of entry, and that the timing window was open. She had been watching a decoy. She turned to Marin. She turned to Fell and Vane, who were reading the same dust cloud and arriving at the same conclusions. She was 18 years old and alone in a fortress with 2 uncertain lords and 40 soldiers against what that dust cloud suggested was coming. And the man who had planned 20 years for this moment was riding north away from it. She looked at the southern road. She thought about who she had been 6 days ago. She thought, not anymore. Close every gate, she said. Every one. Now. And then she walked toward the war room, and she started building the plan that would determine whether Lucien Draven came back to a fortress or to ruins, and she did not let her hands shake, and she did not look south again. The southern force was 200 soldiers. She knew it within 20 minutes of closing the gates. Marin's people on the walls counted the dust and the formation and gave her the number with the flat precision of people who understood that the truth of a bad situation was more useful than a comfortable estimate. 200 imperial soldiers moving in battle formation against a fortress currently held by 40 men, 2 uncertain lords, and a duchess who had been inside Nocturne for less than a day. She looked at the number. She sat with it for exactly the time it took to absorb it, without panic and without the specific paralysis that came from letting the arithmetic win before the situation was finished. Then she went to work. Vane, she said, "You're 16 men. Position them at the secondary gate and the east wall, not to fight, to be visible. A wall that looks occupied discourages the first push." He was looking at her with the expression he'd been calibrating since breakfast. Something had shifted in it over the course of the day, moving from assessment toward something she didn't want to name yet because naming it would make it a liability. "And the western approach," he said. "Fell's people own the western road. If her garrison received word before Edric cleared the pass—" She stopped, looked at Marin. "I sent riders when we discovered the escape," Marin said. 30 minutes ago." "How long to Fell's garrison?" "Fast rider, 40 minutes. She looked at the water clock on the war room table. 40 minutes from 30 minutes ago meant 10 minutes from now. Fell's garrison was 200 soldiers of its own, and unlike the imperial force, it knew this territory. It knew every approach, every choke point, every place where 200 soldiers on flat road became 30 soldiers in a narrow pass. 10 minutes. She needed to hold the southern gate for 10 minutes. She needed to do it without Lucien, without Rhine's cavalry, with 40 men and 2 lords, and the specific advantage of walls that the imperial force would have to come through rather than over, which meant the force multiplier was hers if she used it correctly and theirs if she didn't. She had been inside these walls for less than a day. She looked at the maps. She found what she needed in 40 seconds. The northern architecture of Nocturne had been built for exactly this scenario, the scenario where the external force was larger and the defensive advantage was internal. 3 choke points between the southern gate and the fortress's inner yard, each one designed to compress attacking force into a narrower front, each one operable by a smaller defending group than the attacking numbers suggested. She didn't need to hold 200 soldiers. She needed to hold a gate that was wide enough for 8 men at a time. She told Vane's captain what she needed and where. She told Marin's people what to watch for. She found the fortress's stores herself and confirmed what the armory held and what it didn't, and made the calculation of how to deploy what was available for maximum deterrence rather than maximum engagement, because engagement was not the goal was time. She was doing all of this without shaking. Later, she would think about that, about the specific quality of extremity that burns everything unnecessary away and leaves only function, only the pure stripped-down operation of a mind that has decided it is not finished yet. She would think about how she hadn't known that was in her until she needed it. She would think about how you never knew what you were built of, until the situation required you to find out. But that was later. Right now, she was standing on the south wall watching 200 imperial soldiers form up in the field below the fortress. And she was counting down from 10 minutes, and she was not afraid in any way that interfered with what she needed to do. Oh. They struck at the gate at the 7-minute mark. Not a full assault, a probe, testing the resistance, reading the defense. Seraphine watched from the wall as the initial advance hit the outer gate and found it held, and she watched the Imperial commander read the resistance and signal for the battering formation, and she watched that formation assemble with the organized patience of men who understood that a gate was a problem of physics and sufficient force and time. She looked south down the western road. She saw the dust at the 8-minute mark. Fell's garrison came in from the west at a full cavalry run. 200 soldiers with the territorial instinct of people fighting for ground they knew, and they hit the Imperial force's flank at the 9-minute mark with the specific, devastating effect of a force that had been anticipated and prepared for versus a force that had been moving with its attention on a single direction. The Imperial commander had planned for a fortress. He had not planned for a second army. The southern field became something she watched from the wall with a quality of concentrated attention that had nothing exhilarating in it. Just the steady, terrible assessment of a woman learning what it looked like when organized human violence was applied at close quarters to a problem, and what the cost of it was in the specific, irreducible currency of people who would not be standing up again. The Imperial force held for 20 minutes. Then it broke. Not in panic. In the controlled, professional withdrawal of a military force that had made a calculation and revised it. They pulled south in formation, leaving their dead, and Fell's cavalry let them go rather than pursue because pursuit into open country against a regrouping force was a different calculation than territorial defense, and Fell's commander was experienced enough to know the difference. The south gate held. Seraphine stood on the wall and watched the Imperial dust recede and felt the specific unfamiliar sensation of a situation resolving in the direction she had planned rather than the direction it had been trying to go. She was still on the wall when she heard the northern gate open. Rhine's cavalry came back first. She counted them from the wall and felt the count land in her chest with a weight she hadn't expected. Fewer than had left. The specific arithmetic of what that meant. Lucien came through the gate last. He was on his horse, but riding in a way that told her something was wrong before she could see his face. Slightly forward, the compensating posture of someone managing pain and not letting it show in the face because the face was still performing command. His left side. She catalogued it from the wall and was moving before she had consciously decided to move. She reached the courtyard as he dismounted. He did it with the controlled precision of someone who had rehearsed the movement in their head before executing it. Each step managed, nothing abandoned to chance. When his feet hit the ground, he stood still for a half-second with one hand on the saddle, and she saw the side of his coat, and she understood what the dark color there meant. "I'm fine," he said, before she was close enough to say anything. "You're bleeding." "I'm aware." He turned to face her, and his face was the controlled version, everything managed, and underneath the management she could see the exhaustion that came from managing it too long. "Edric?" "He didn't make it to the Emperor's advance riders." Her voice was level. "Rhine's cavalry intercepted him at the pass. He's dead." "Yes." He absorbed this without visible response. He looked at the courtyard, at the state of the walls, at Fell's soldiers still visible on the southern approaches. He was doing what commanders did, reading the situation, accounting for what had changed while he was gone. "The southern force," he said. "Fell's garrison. They held." She paused. "They're gone. Withdrew south." He looked at her. She watched him read her. The walls, the gate, the specific condition of a fortress that had been defended by 40 men and 2 lords and one person who had been a duke's wife for less than 24 hours. And she watched him arrive at what had happened while he was riding north, and she watched what that arrival did to his face. The controlled version cracked, just slightly, just enough to show what was underneath, which was not weakness but its opposite. The specific vulnerability of someone who has been holding something enormous for a very long time and has just been given unexpectedly and without preparation a reason to put some of it down. "You held it," he said. "Yes. Alone." "Vain and fell," she said. Not alone. Seraphine. His voice had dropped to that low register that carried without volume, and it had something in it she hadn't heard before. Something that wasn't performance and wasn't strategy and wasn't the careful management of a man who had spent 20 years building walls around the specific parts of himself that had been damaged most. Something direct and unguarded and real. You held my fortress. She looked at him. At the blood on his coat and the exhaustion in his face and the scar that caught the afternoon light and the dark eyes that were looking at her without the assessment, without the documentation, just looking. It's mine too, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said. It is, then. The fortress physician spent 2 hours on his side. The wound was deep but clean, a blade that had found the gap in his armor at the pass, and had been managed immediately enough to prevent the complications that turned survivable wounds into something else. He submitted to the treatment with the specific, slightly insulted patience of a man who understood it was necessary and resented the necessity, and Seraphine sat in the chair beside the table and watched the physician work and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say, and she was done performing. When the physician left, the room was quiet. Lucien was on the treatment table, sitting up because he wouldn't lie down, his coat off and the bandaging done, and the room had the specific quality of a space where something had been discharged, the tension of the last 5 days present in the air like the smell of a fire that had recently gone out. She said, Edric. He looked at the wall. Tell me what happened at the pass. He was quiet for a moment. He saw us coming. He didn't run. A pause. He turned his horse and waited. She thought about that. A man who had built an exit into his own cell, who had spent 30 years preparing contingencies, who had survived and operated and managed inside the weight of what he'd done, turning his horse at the end and waiting. He said something, she said. Not a question. He said he was tired. Lucien's voice was flat, carrying it without embellishment. He said he had been tired for a long time. The room was quiet. She thought about what it cost to carry something like that for 30 years. Not the specific crimes of it, the weight of the architecture required to contain it, the constant management of the distance between who you were and who you appeared to be, the loneliness of a life spent entirely inside a performance you couldn't stop without ending everything. She had been inside her own smaller version of that architecture for 3 years, and she knew the specific exhaustion of it, how it accumulated in the bones, how it changed the quality of every interaction because nothing was ever quite real. 30 years of that. She wasn't going to forgive Edric Vale. Forgiveness was a specific act that required a specific set of conditions, and she was honest enough to know she wasn't there, might never be there. And that was its own truth she would carry without performing sentiment about it. But she understood the exhaustion. She understood the specific human bankruptcy of a person who had made a catastrophic choice and then spent decades paying the interest on it through more catastrophic choices, because the alternative was confronting the original debt, and that confrontation had felt unsurvivable. Some debts worked that way. They compounded in the dark. You blame yourself, she said. Still. He didn't answer. Not for the same thing, she said. Not your mother anymore. Or not only. For trusting him. For 30 years of trusting him. He looked at her. You trusted someone who had earned it, she said, or had appeared to earn it. There's no version of being human where you don't extend that to someone who has been beside you for 30 years, and there's no system of self-assessment that would have caught it earlier without also poisoning every other relationship you have. She paused. You're not going to reason your way to a world where trusting people you trust is the mistake. Something moved in his face, something that had been in there since she'd met him, carried in the specific quality of a man who had been turning the same damage over for so long that the damage had become the primary object of his interior life, rather than the thing it had happened to. I know that, he said. You know it, she said. You haven't let yourself feel it yet. He looked at her for a long time in the quiet of the physician's room. She held his gaze without managing it, without performing patience, just present. The specific presence of someone who was not going to let him retreat behind the controlled version and was not going to pretend she didn't see the door he was standing in front of. I failed her, he said. His voice was quiet. Your mother. However it was engineered, however the intelligence was corrupted. I failed to reach her in time and she died. That's the fact. The rest is context. The rest is the difference between a wound that heals and one that doesn't, she said. Context isn't an excuse. It's an anatomy. You need to know the anatomy of a thing if you're going to live inside it. He looked at his hands. Large hands, scarred in the specific way of a man who had used them for real things over a long time. She would have known what to do with all of this, he said. Your mother. She had a clarity about what mattered and what didn't. She never wasted her attention on things that couldn't be changed. A pause. I see it in you. Something moved in Seraphine's chest, complex and old and not fully available to her. She let it be there without requiring it to resolve into something clean. Tell me about her, she said. He looked at her with an expression that was briefly surprised and then wasn't. He had expected, she realized, for that to be a hard thing to ask. Expected her to protect herself from it, or to need protection. He was revising that assessment in real time. He told her. He told her about a woman who had understood the weight of the thing she carried without being crushed by it, who had been cautious not from fear but from the specific disciplined patience of someone who understood that certain kinds of change required building something solid before you moved, who had been funny. He said that simply, matter-of-factly, the way you say something when you've held it private for so long that saying it feels like discovering it still exists, who had looked at Lucien Draven with the specific, unsentimental clarity of someone who saw what he was trying to be and refused to pretend it was already accomplished. Seraphine listened. She listened the way you listen to something that is also the shape of yourself, seeing in the description something about where she had come from, the specific inheritance of a woman she had lost at 12 and had been trying to reconstruct from fragments ever since. When he finished, the room was different. Not softer. That wasn't the right word. But settled. The way a room settles after the fire has been burning long enough that the cold is gone from the corners. She would have told you, Seraphine said, that guilt is only useful if you do something with it, and that you've been doing something with it for 6 years. You've been doing the thing she was trying to do. He was quiet. She would have told you, she said, to stop now. The part where you carry it as punishment. She would have told you to carry it differently. He looked at her for a long, unguarded moment. She watched something happen in his face that she had not seen there before and suspected very few people had ever seen. The specific expression of a man setting something down that he had not known he was still allowed to set down. Not resolved, not healed, but lighter, in the way that things are lighter when they've been given their real name instead of the name you've been calling them in the dark. You're 18 years old, he said. His voice had something in it that was not quite what she'd have called warmth before this week, but that she was recategorizing now. I keep telling people that, she said. Nobody seems to find it as disqualifying as they expect to. The thing in his face completed its movement. It landed somewhere she recognized, something genuine, unperformed, the expression of a man surprised into honesty. No, he said, they don't. Yet. 3 days later, in the great hall of Nocturine, with the northern lords assembled and the documents spread on the table between them, Seraphine Vale signed her name as Seraphine Draven for the first time in a formal legal capacity. Not the rushed marriage papers of a way station morning, but a full constitutional filing, the bloodline claim documented in imperial legal language that had been prepared with Lucien's legal scholars over 2 grinding days, every technical flaw addressed, every procedural requirement met. Vane signed as witness first, then Rhine, then Fell, who set the pen down and looked at Seraphine across the table and said, "When this goes to the capital, the Emperor will move everything he has." "Yes," Seraphine said. "You're ready for that." She looked at Fell, at this woman who had spent the last 3 days moving from alliance calculation toward something she hadn't declared yet, but that had a specific quality of commitment in it that felt real rather than political. "No," she said honestly, "but I'll be less unready every day between now and when it comes." She paused. "That's all ready ever is." Fell looked at her for a moment. Then she signed. The filing went by courier that afternoon. 3 separate riders on 3 separate routes, one to the imperial courts, one to the constitutional scholars Lucien had been cultivating for years, and one to a network of contacts across the empire's southern and eastern territories who had their own reasons to want the emperor's corrupt structure examined in the specific, undeniable light of a legitimate legal challenge filed on solid ground. The emperor would receive it within 5 days. What he did with it would determine the shape of the next year. She didn't know what that shape would be. She knew it would be violent and political and exhausting, and that it would require her to become things she hadn't become yet, and to use capacities she didn't fully know she had. She knew it would cost something she couldn't yet calculate. She stood at the window of the east tower as the couriers rode out through the main gate, and she watched them until they were small in the distance, and then watched the distance itself for a while. The northern landscape doing what it did in late afternoon, the mountains going through their color changes, the valley darkening from the bottom up, the sky doing that specific northern thing where it stayed light at the horizon long after the middle had gone gray. She heard him come in without turning. He stood beside her. Not close, not far. The distance of 2 people who had not yet established their ordinary geography, but who were no longer strangers to each other's presence. "Tell me something true," she said. He was quiet for a moment. In the week she had known him, she had learned that his silences were not evasion. They were the time he took to determine what was actually true rather than what was convenient or protective or palatable. "I don't know what this becomes," he said. "Between us. I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to tell you something is certain when it isn't. I know that. What I know is—" He paused. "What I know is that you are not what I expected, which is not a small thing for a man who expected quite a lot." She looked at him, at the profile in the late northern light, the scar, the jaw, the specific weathered quality of a face that had been through more years than she had lived and had come out the other side. Not bitter exactly, not destroyed exactly, but shaped by what it had survived into something that knew its own density. "What did you expect?" she said. "Someone I'd need to protect," he said. "Protect and manage and carry. And instead," he said, "someone who held my fortress while I was gone and then sat beside me while the physician worked and told me things I needed to hear in a way I could actually receive them." He looked at her. "Someone I want beside me, not behind me." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's going to be inconvenient for you sometimes," she said. "I expect it will be," he said. "I find I don't mind." The northern light was doing its final work on the mountains, pulling the last warmth from the rock faces, leaving something clean and cold and truthful in its place. The valley below the fortress was settling into its evening sounds, the garrison changing rotations, somewhere a horse, somewhere the distant ring of something in the smithy that hadn't stopped for anything all week. She thought about the woman in the painting above the Vale mantelpiece, the rolling hills and gentle light, the version of the past that people built to tell themselves who they were. She thought about the ash she had been scrubbing from the parlor floor a week ago. She thought about the specific distance between that floor and this window, and the woman who had crossed it, and what had been shed in the crossing, and what had been found. She thought about her mother, not the grave and the rain of it, but the woman Lucien had described, the clarity, the patience, the humor that had survived everything it had needed to survive. She thought, "I am made of you too. I didn't know how much until this week." She turned back to the window. "The emperor is going to come," she said. "Yes. Not a probe, not a legal instrument. He's going to come with everything he has." "Yes. Then we have work to do." She said it simply, without performance, without pretending it was anything other than the weight of what it actually was. "Before he does." Lucien looked at her. In his face, something she had been watching since the physician's room, that new quality of lightness, not happiness exactly, not the absence of weight, but the specific expression of a man who had learned to carry his weight differently, who had been given, by a week of impossible circumstances and one 18-year-old who refused to be managed, the thing that guilt and self-recrimination had been crowding out for 6 years. Not absolution. Something more durable than absolution. Permission to keep going. "Yes," he said, "we do." She was still looking at the mountains when he put his hand over hers on the window ledge. Not a dramatic gesture, just a hand, warm and scarred, placed over hers with the quiet certainty of someone who had decided something and wasn't going to perform it. She turned her hand over. She held it. Outside, the last light left the mountains. Nocturne settled into its cold northern dark, ancient stone and garrison fires, and the wind coming down from the passes carrying the smell of things that had been standing longer than anyone alive. And two people stood at a window inside it and held what they had built from wreckage, which was not perfect and was not finished and was not free from the war coming toward them down every road at once. But it was real, and it was theirs. And in a world that had spent a considerable effort trying to ensure they would have nothing, that was the only victory that had ever mattered. The empire could burn. They had built something inside the fire,